In the last episode, we broke down why financial systems only begin converging toward new infrastructure when pressure makes the old system too expensive to maintain. But this is the part almost nobody talks about, because once liquidity crises, market stress, regulatory evolution, and operational pressure begin colliding globally, financial systems can start changing much faster than people expect. And this is exactly why XRP price may stay disconnected for long periods of time, until pressure inside the financial system suddenly changes institutional behavior much faster than most people realize. Most XRP holders are still waiting for adoption on the XRP Ledger to move the price of XRP the coin, but the real shift may not happen because institutions suddenly become believers in crypto. The real shift may happen when global financial pressure starts forcing institutions to search for systems that reduce friction under stress, and that changes the entire XRP conversation, because the real question is no longer whether the XRP Ledger works or whether XRP the coin is fast enough. The real question is what happens when the global financial system starts reaching conditions it was never originally designed to handle efficiently, and that pressure may already be building. The financial system institutions rely on today was built around a very different world where markets closed overnight, settlement windows moved slower, capital controls were more regional, cross-border payment expectations were lower, and liquidity moved differently. Most importantly, the cost of inefficiency was easier to tolerate, but global finance is changing. Markets are becoming more connected, more real-time, more global, and more competitive. Capital moves faster, businesses expect settlement faster, consumers expect money to move instantly, and financial systems increasingly operate across time zones, jurisdictions, and digital infrastructure layers simultaneously. And once people begin expecting value to move instantly everywhere, older systems built around delay, fragmentation, and trapped liquidity become much harder to justify economically. That matters because the systems still supporting large portions of global finance were never originally designed for the speed, scale, liquidity demands, and constant settlement expectations now starting to emerge globally. The pressure is changing faster than the systems themselves, and inefficiency does not disappear under pressure, it gets exposed. This is where the biggest misunderstanding in crypto starts appearing, because many people still think the biggest threat to older financial systems is simply that crypto exists. But the real threat is that growing global financial pressure may eventually make inefficiency financially impossible to tolerate at scale, and that changes everything. Once financial systems begin operating under sustained liquidity stress, fragmented settlement systems become much more expensive to maintain. Locked capital becomes expensive. Pre-funded accounts across multiple countries become expensive. Idle liquidity becomes expensive. Delayed settlement becomes expensive. Operational fragmentation becomes expensive. Collateral requirements become more difficult to maintain, and cross-border liquidity management becomes more unstable. As enough pressure begins building across the system simultaneously, institutions stop optimizing for familiarity and start optimizing for survivability, efficiency, liquidity mobility, and settlement reliability under stress. That is how convergence begins. Not because institutions suddenly become excited about crypto assets, and not because the XRP ledger suddenly becomes more technologically impressive, but because pressure changes what systems are willing to tolerate operationally. This is where regulatory evolution starts mattering much more than most people realize. For years, many institutions treated crypto infrastructure as operationally unclear, legally uncertain, or too difficult to integrate safely at scale. But that environment is slowly changing. Custody frameworks are improving, stablecoin regulation is evolving, institutional settlement infrastructure is maturing, and compliance standards are becoming more defined globally. As those barriers slowly begin shrinking, while financial pressure keeps increasing, systems may start searching much more aggressively for anything capable of reducing operational friction under stress. And that is the environment where bridge assets potentially become more important. This is also why the XRP Ledger and XRP the coin still must be separated clearly in this conversation, because the XRP Ledger can continue growing institutionally without forcing XRP the coin to become the primary asset carrying value underneath the system. That distinction still matters because the XRP Ledger can support tokenized assets, stablecoins, settlement systems, payment applications, and institutional infrastructure growth, while XRP the coin itself still remains optional inside many flows. Many XRP holders still oversimplify the situation because they assume that once institutions enter crypto infrastructure, XRP the coin automatically wins by default. But global finance does not work that way. Institutions optimize for the path that reduces the most friction under current conditions. And right now, many institutions still have alternatives they consider operationally safer or easier to integrate. Stablecoins continue growing, internal banking rails continue functioning, Swift infrastructure still dominates global messaging, and pre-funded liquidity systems still support large portions of international settlement. Despite their inefficiencies, those systems are still familiar enough for institutions to tolerate the friction for now. But this is where market stress changes the equation, because financial systems rarely break all at once. they become progressively harder to maintain efficiently as complexity, liquidity demands, and settlement expectations continue increasing globally. During periods of stable liquidity, institutions can tolerate inefficiency longer. They can tolerate fragmented liquidity pools, delayed settlement windows, and trapped capital across multiple jurisdictions. But during periods of tighter liquidity conditions, rising operational costs, collateral stress, banking instability, or global market volatility, the cost of maintaining inefficient systems starts compounding much faster. If global settlement pressure continues rising over the next decade, systems designed around fragmented liquidity and delayed settlement may become increasingly difficult to scale efficiently, and that is where pressure starts accelerating convergence. Once enough friction begins building simultaneously across global payment systems, institutions stop asking whether new infrastructure is interesting and start asking whether older infrastructure is becoming operationally dangerous to maintain. That is the shift, and this is where XRP the coin potentially becomes more relevant under specific conditions, not because institutions suddenly want speculation and not because they become emotionally attached to crypto, but because systems under stress begin prioritizing liquidity efficiency much more aggressively. If XRP the coin can reduce pre-funding requirements, improve settlement speed, reduce liquidity fragmentation, and move value across corridors more efficiently during stressed market conditions, then institutions may eventually have stronger operational reasons to begin selecting XRP the coin more consistently. That is the key, because selection under pressure matters far more than excitement, community belief, or headlines. Systems do not converge toward efficiency when inefficiency remains manageable. Systems converge when inefficiency becomes operationally dangerous. As enough financial pressure begins building globally, institutions start reevaluating what they previously considered acceptable friction, and that is how dependence slowly begins forming. One corridor becomes more efficient. One liquidity path becomes easier to maintain. One settlement structure reduces operational complexity more consistently. One routing structure lowers capital pressure more effectively. Over time, repeated selection begins forming around the systems reducing the most friction under real-world stress, and that is how optionality starts shrinking quietly, gradually, and under pressure. Once optionality starts shrinking, systems begin standardizing around the paths that perform best under those conditions, and that is the difference between technology existing and systems depending on it. This is why understanding macro pressure matters far more than reacting to headlines about adoption, because adoption alone does not force convergence. Pressure does. Until the global financial environment creates stronger incentives to reduce liquidity fragmentation, trapped capital, settlement inefficiency, and operational complexity, institutions can continue tolerating older systems longer than many XRP holders expect. But if those pressures continue intensifying globally over time, the systems capable of reducing friction most effectively may become increasingly difficult to ignore. That is where the XRP conversation becomes much bigger than price speculation, because now you are no longer asking whether XRP the coin works technically, you are asking whether global financial pressure could eventually create conditions where avoiding XRP coin becomes less efficient than using XRP coin, because that is the shift that actually matters. And in the next episode, we're going to break down the part almost nobody in crypto wants to talk about: how stablecoins may actually become the transition layer between traditional finance and systems like the XRP Ledger, and why that could both slow down and eventually strengthen the long-term role of XRP the coin globally, because the financial system may not move directly from traditional finance into XRP coin. It may move through stablecoins first.